Okay.
Doesn't say live up there though.
That's right.
Oh, now it does. It just came on. Okay, we're reconvening our afternoon session and welcoming our Legislative Counsel, Michael O'Grady, to talk with us about the areas of our jurisdiction that he covers for Legislative Counsel. Welcome, Michael.
Good afternoon. This is Mike O'Grady with Ledge Counsel. I put together a quick bulleted outline of my subject matter and with some of the pending issues underneath. I just now sent it to Kate. I apologize for my late send to Kate, but I also have paper copies if anyone would like a paper copy.
You can put it up on the shared screen too.
Yeah, is that
For now and then, yeah.
Okay. So generally, I do what I call the media. I do the waste, the water, toxic substances, the hazardous substances. I also do fish and wildlife, and I'll also do some of those things that overlap with land use and agriculture, such as what I refer as the chicken and composting bill from a couple of years ago. But there are multiple federal laws that are involved with the media, with water, with waste, with hazardous waste. And on top of those federal laws, the state has often adopted more stringent requirements than federal requirements. And so the state has to balance both the federal policies and the state policies. And that's what I try to help you all with. Lately, you've been hearing a lot about waste issues, whether or not it's the operation of the landfill, leachate from the landfill, how long the landfill will last for. There are definitely very interested advocates in how the landfill is managed now and going into the future. You'll continue to hear that, especially around the issue of PFAS, which are perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances. I'll talk about them a little bit later. But another issue, a waste issue, is the bottle bill. The bottle bill passed your committee and the House, and it passed the Senate committee and the Senate last year, but in very different versions. Last year, you did kind of a more traditional, I would say, bottle bill amendment. You amended the actual substance of the existing bottle bill. You expanded the definition of beverage. You addressed what a container was. You looked at the handling fee, increased the handling fee for redemption people who are managing beverage containers that are not commingled. It was a traditional bottle bill amendment. The Senate took that and put an extended producer responsibility program onto the bottle bill. Now, extended producer responsibility is it's a mechanism that states use to require the manufacturer of a product to take responsibility for its collection and ultimate disposition, and to pay for that collection and ultimate disposition free of charge to the citizens of the state. That's what the Senate did. It created that EPR program. Senate producer responsibility would require manufacturers and distributors of beverages to basically set up a program where they were going to collect all of those containers and manage their disposition free of charge. Now, I say free of charge in air quotes because there are extended producer responsibility programs in Vermont. There's the e-waste program, there's mercury containing light bulbs, there's batteries, there's paint. There's a couple of other smaller ones. Some of those have a fee associated with them. When you go into to buy paint, you now have a fee on your receipt when you go and buy paint. That's to pay for the extended producer responsibility program for paint. But when you go and buy a battery, you don't pay an extra fee for that battery, but the cost of that program is incorporated into the cost of the product. So that is what the EPR program that was proposed in the Senate would have done. It would have kept the deposit, your 5 cents. The 5 cents is not enough to pay for anything, and the 5 cent goes back to the purchaser as well. So you would have shifted the cost of all collection and disposition to the manufacturer and distributor. That's what the Senate bill would have done. That cost would have trickled down into the cost of a product, just as the bottle bill cost already trickled down into the cost of the product. Because the cost to run the bottle bill system right now is expensive for manufacturers and distributors. They do have to pick up the containers. They do have to manage disposition. What was part of the issue in the Senate bill is the scope. It expanded the scope of the bill, and particularly the problematic container was wine and glass containers. The retailers were very concerned about their ability to manage wine bottles, particularly where would they store them in a small store that's doing redemption? Is it an appropriate thing for, if they're heavy, can we move them? So those are all issues that came up towards the end of last session, which kind of ground that bill to a halt. But I think you're going to hear more about that. I think some of the issues that came up can be identified. One of the issues that came up in the Senate is like the bill's too complicated. The bill is an extended producer responsibility bill. They're complicated, but the state has done them 5 or 6 times, and the model that's used in that Senate bill is the model that the state already uses for most of its products.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. Going back on what you're talking about, paints and the fees, could you explain that, what the fee is?
Sure. So there's an organization called a product stewardship organization, and for paint, it's called Paint Care. And Paint Care represents 98% of the paint manufacturers in the country. And so what they do is they take that fee, and it's used by the paint stewardship by the product stewardship organization, Paint Care, and they run that program to collect all the waste paint from collection points and then dispose of it, either recycle or properly dispose of paint, because some paint is hazardous and you have to manage it as hazardous.
That's water-based paint as well?
Yeah, they collect all versions of paint, and the fee is on all versions of paint.
Because I had someone do some work at my house recently, and they said I could take my paint cans, as long as there's paint in them, I can take them back to the, is that fee that they're charging to help alleviate the expense of handling the?
Yes, and that's what product stewardship does. And many of the programs, what the plan that that the stewardship organization needs to implement, it says that existing collection points, basically, or existing municipal solid waste entities, can continue to serve as a collection point, but they have to have all their costs paid. And so that's one of the things that your local solid waste entities like, is because it shifts that cost of managing those substances that can be hazardous back to the manufacturer, and they get paid for what they do.
Thank you.
So in addition to the bottle bill, there's the PFAS issue. Does everyone know what PFAS is? It's a chemical that was manufactured. It has multiple uses, viscosity. It's also one of the things that helps with nonstick coating, or used to help with nonstick coating. It's in carpets, it's in fabric, it's in Gore-Tex. It's in many, many things, or was in many, many things. It's called the forever chemical because it's very hard, if not impossible, to break it down to the point where it can be disposed of and it is no longer presenting a risk to health or the environment. The issue in Bennington with Saint Germain, that was a PFOA issue. That is a PFAS issue. That what happened there is they thought when that chemical was incinerated, when it was fired, that it would break down, but it didn't break down. Instead, it deposed, it went up into the air, and through rain was spread all over that region. There is PFAS everywhere. I am not kidding. It is in us, in you, it's in me. It's probably in everyone that you know. It's in the soil, it's in the water, it's in the drinking water. It's because it doesn't break down. It just accumulates in the environment. And that requires response. The US EPA has adopted what it's called a roadmap to PFAS regulation. They just issued their status report on their roadmap in November, things that they're doing, listing certain PFOA substances as hazardous materials under CERCLA, establishing standards for drinking water and soil. So EPA is taking a stance and they're implementing their roadmap, but you're going to hear from advocates that Vermont needs to do more, that Vermont can do more than what EPA is doing, that Vermont should set a zero drinking water standard for PFOA and some of the other PFAS. There was a bill in 2019 where you required A&R to come up with the drinking water standard for 5 PFAS substances. They have done that. You also directed them to, by 2024, to come up with a surface water standard for PFAS. They haven't got there yet, but they're working on it. They're working with EPA on it. But there are people, advocates, interested parties, maybe even legislators that really want to do more than what EPA is doing, and they want to do it faster than what EPA is proposing. So you'll probably hear about that. And one of the things that PFOA, PFAS causes a problem about is the land application of biosolids. So 60% of this state manages their wastewater through septic systems. And those septic systems need to be pumped, and then that waste needs to be dealt with. Currently, you can land apply some of those waste if they are properly treated or the land application is permitted. In addition, wastewater treatment facilities, the other 40% of the state that manages their wastewater through a pollution abatement facility, they have residuals as well, and they have to deal with them some way also. The state allows for land application of those. Those materials have PFAS in them. So the state effectively needs to manage its waste, and they need to manage it. And the question is land application of that material with PFAS in it an appropriate action?
Representative Sevilla, where do we apply that?
They have to be permitted by A&R at specific sites, and they have to have what are called nutrient management plans for the land application of it.
Ag fields, farms.
You've all driven by one.
We put it on farms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's in there.
It's not used for it anymore, but in the Richmond Flats, that field, right as you're coming over the hump, and there's a field there, and it's the barns, what's the name of that barn? I can't remember the name of that barn, but that used to be a land application site. You'd see the green tractors out there, the honey wagons out there all the time. They were land applying biosolids.
Do you have a sense of how many of those sites there are around the state?
I used to know the answer to this. There was a report a couple of years ago. I don't recall off the top of my head. Eamon Tuhig at A&R produced a report on it, and I can find that report and get it.
That would be great. Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Just a question, the PFAS issue itself, what's the history on that? I mean, how far back does that go before it actually became a concern?
Before it would what? I couldn't.
Became a concern.
Well,
I think it depends. The answer to that depends on whether it's a national issue, because nationally it's been a concern for about 10 or more years.
Mhm.
In Vermont, it really became a concern. There was PFAS contamination that was found in Hoosick Falls, and it was determined that it probably came from San Germain, and that led people in Bennington to question whether or not that same contamination was in Bennington, which led to A&R doing testing, which led to blood testing. And so that was more like 2017. A similar issue, and I don't know how involved your committee is going to be with this, is PCB testing and remediation in schools. Polychlorinated biphenyls are one of those chemicals that was prohibited in 1978, 1980, but they were commonly used in building materials prior to that time, and they are one of those things that they degrade. They decompose very slowly, and when they do in certain materials, they off gas. And so the chemical off gases into a room without proper ventilation or treatment, it can create a health issue for those exposed to it. Most schools in Vermont were built before 1980. So there's a significant likelihood that some schools are going to have PCB contamination in them. US EPA has standards for PCB remediation. When it triggers or goes over a certain point, you have to remove the material from the building. So A&R is doing testing. It's air testing. They're not kind of disturbing the material to try to get a positive result. They're seeing if it's off-gassing. They're supposed to report back to the General Assembly January 15, 2023 with their preliminary results and estimates for cost for testing and potential remediation cost. I think you're probably going to see something from A&R that's kind of a staged response. Do the testing. If it's positive at a certain level, determine whether or not it can be managed, whether or not you can reduce or eliminate exposure, then whether or not you can do minor remediation. And then, of course, if you find something that's really significant, what do you do then?
one question. Representative Sibilia.
Very high level, Michael. To what extent did the COVID HVAC work? Are we considering, would that have had any effect on this? Could it have had an effect? Are we thinking about if it had an effect?
The air systems installed for COVID. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know enough to answer that. I think you would need to talk to somebody at A&R that's been working on the PCB testing.
Okay, thank you.
And they're pretty invested. The people that are working on it are diligently doing what they can. I also do water quality. Water quality used to be like pretty much the only reason I'd come into committee, specifically because of the Lake Champlain TMDL and US EPA's response to that and the subsequent statewide water quality initiative. Because of the significant work this committee and other committees have done over the past 5 to 10 years, I don't see a lot of issues in that traditional water quality realm. US EPA has been giving the state passing grades because it literally does a report card for the state. The money has been appropriated. You created a system called Clean Water Service Providers to help move the money out into the communities through a mechanism other than a state agency. That has started to roll out. You're going to get a report on that in January as part of the Clean Water Investment Report. That's going pretty well right now. Now you're going to have that debate between agriculture and A&R. They don't like each other. They don't like working with each other. You've told them several times to cut it out and like start cooperating with each other. You even forced the Secretary of Administration to come back with a report on how the Secretary of Administration was going to basically eliminate that problem. It's calmed down a bit, but there's still tension between those two agencies regarding regulation of water quality. The Agency of Ag thinks that they do more than they're accredited for. The Agency of Natural Resources questions some of their claims. There's always the tension about enforcement, who enforces and when, what needs to be done when there's enforcement. That is ongoing, even though the overall water quality initiative is successful. You still have that low level tension between those two agencies and how that they interact.
Representative Sebelian.
Any similar tensions with transportation?
Transportation kind of got on board a long time ago, and the state adopted a specific permit called the TS4 for transportation that at the state agency level has been working fairly well. Now you'll have people question whether or not it's implemented entirely consistently across the state, but I have heard very little issues with the TS4. Where you're going to find issues is that it's the municipal road general permit. And that's the requirement for municipalities to implement stormwater management controls on, especially in back roads and roads that had not been subject to management prior to adoption of. That can be expensive. That can be implemented differently from municipality to municipality, even though they're all supposed to implement them the same. You'll get people that will raise concerns about them. But honestly, I think considering the scope of that program and how many towns were involved, every town, pretty much, and it's been pretty successful.
The big difference and conflict is that A&R and Ag both do enforcement for water quality. So I think that's where their tension comes from, and it gets confusing for farmers.
Who does enforcement with the towns?
Just A&R.
Just A&R for municipal roads, yeah.
Okay.
And they work closely with the municipal towns, especially the larger ones where there's more issues, but it's still, I mean, it's a cost, and the municipality has to assume that cost, and the state has provided some funding for some of it, but you know your municipalities, they don't like, to be given a significant cost without some assistance. Moving on from there, wetlands. There's a pending rule change from A&R. It's kind of changing how what used to be called the presumptive wetlands are going to be regulated. I've reviewed the rule. I don't really see anything under the LCAR standards to raise objection to. I posed a question to the agency and they suitably responded. So that rule is going to be moved through. There's also questions about how A&R does mitigation. So when there's development or an activity in a wetland, what that permitted person needs to do in order to mitigate that impact. A&R's rules are not as comprehensive as other state rules. on that issue or other jurisdictions' rules. And so I've heard debate about what to do with that and whether or not Vermont needs to change its mitigation standards. Similar issue is riparian protection. You all know what happened with Irene. Irene kind of spurred a conversation about whether or not local municipalities were effectively regulating flood hazards and whether the state was as well. There were some efforts that came out of that to improve flood hazard regulation, but it hasn't really been implemented at the municipal level at the degree that people had hoped. So there's conversation out there about how to get better flood hazard protection if municipalities aren't going to voluntarily adopt it themselves. Then aquatic nuisance control. There's a couple of different issues with aquatic nuisance control. Pesticides or herbicides are used for aquatic nuisance control. There are some that are very concerned about when those herbicides or pesticides are used and how they're used. You saw an issue in Lake Iroquois for a while. For milfoil control, there's similar concerns in similar lakes. In addition, there's a question about funding of aquatic nuisance control. One of the best ways to control aquatic nuisance is to do things like boat washes and stations, check stations, but that costs money. You need people there and you need some of the equipment that's there to do that. And how do you provide that money? Plus, the lake associations that do aquatic nuisance control, they like to get paid for some of their activities, or at least cost shared. And so there is a grant program for that, but whether or not there's enough money for all those controls is a question.
Representative Pat.
Could you define a little bit more the term nuisance? Because at least from what you said, it appears that the nuisances are materials that somehow get in the water. Are there other, I can think of constituent complaints I've been getting about other nuisances that affect water quality in the lake?
It's really not necessarily materials. It's really vegetation and wildlife. Like Eurasian milfoil in Lake Iroquois, the spiny flea in Lake Champlain, the sea lamprey in Lake Champlain, the water chestnut in the lower part of Lake Champlain, kind of focusing on Lake Champlain. But
So just so it would not necessarily include the most complaints I've gotten in the last year from two lakes in two different towns are wake boats, or boats that make significant small lakes.
no, it is not. It is not a wake boat. The wake boat provision regulation of wake boats would be regulated under what are called the use of waters rule,
Okay.
as opposed to the aquatic nuisance control program.
Some of my constituents have used the term nuisance.
I understand the context, but it is.
Okay.
It's two different regulatory
Thank you.
programs.
The Bill Cunningham.
So many
Yeah.
nuisances in the world. Representative Smith.
Thank you. There's a lot of nuisances, but I know wake boats on Lake Seymour, there are 4 owners of property on the lake, and they're very respectful of the lake. They go to the deepest part of the lake where they're not going to affect the bottom of it. There needs to be more education to those. But what I wanted to ask you, you mentioned there are money programs for aquatic nuisances. Can you tell me what they are and how a village or a town might go about?
So it's called the Aquatic Nuisance Grant Program. It's funded. It's a significant part of the funding is a percentage of the motorboat registration fee. I think it's 19%, which is a weird number, but I think that's 19% of your motorboat registration fee goes to aquatic nuisance control. And then the Agency of Natural Resources runs a grant program. They generally work with the lake associations to do that. If you have an active lake association that's doing aquatic nuisance control, they know about it.
They do, okay, because I know we have a milfoil concern in Lake, well, it's it's called Lake Derby now. It was Derby Pond for years, but that's part of the drinking water, town Derby. They have come to the town, the village of Derby Center owns a water company. They've come to our select board and asked for some of our ARPA funds. And
The Lake Association doing aquatic nuisance.
village
Okay.
/ Lake Association, yeah. So if we can find programs that will help fund something to try to get this milfoil out, we can use our ARPA funds in our town for equipment and road rebuilding and things like that.
Yep, I understand.
Aquatic nuisance grant program, you said.
I can send you the statute.
I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
So that's water. Another issue that I work on is forestry, usually when it relates to kind of the natural resources aspect of it and not the industry aspect of it, but I worked on the industry aspect of it as well. The bill that you this committee most recently worked on was last year, the enrollment of reserve forest land and use value appraisal. You required a report from them. The report has been submitted, was submitted on December 30th. I don't know if you actually got it.
I don't think I
Is it
got it.
posted somewhere, Michael?
Yeah, it's on the legislative website.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. Is this connected to 30 by 30?
Somewhat.
Yes.
I mean, not only that it is also a way of helping us meet our Vermont conservation design goals. But it is not related to permanent conservation. It's related to allowing some limited forest lands to be managed for old timber or old growth characteristics
But they would count
Within the
towards the
current-
30.
within the current use, not unless they were conserved.
Great. Okay, got it. Okay.
Current use isn't permanently conserved necessarily.
So that's really the most recent forestry bill you worked on, land management bill for the Department of Forests and Parks. It's really the most recent thing you've done. And then the other issue or category I work on is fish and wildlife. You've done a bunch of work on this in the past couple of years, looking at multiple issues. Last year, you enacted two pretty significant bills. One was a moratorium on hunting coyote with dogs. That moratorium is in place until the Fish and Wildlife Board rule that you directed them to adopt becomes effective. And I can't find anything on what they've been doing on that rule. They did receive a petition to establish a season for the taking of coyote, because currently there is no season right now, but they denied that petition. And since then, I haven't seen much action on the moratorium or adopting the rule to end the moratorium.
I expect that the commissioner will update us tomorrow.
Okay. And that may just be, I just haven't been able to find anything on that. In contrast, last year, you required the Fish and Wildlife Board to adopt best management practices for trapping and to report back to you with their recommendations by January 15th, 2023. They've had a working group that is working on that issue. They have a draft out. I have the draft here somewhere.
Oh, there's the draft.
The last time they met, I think, was November 29th, but then they issued their recommendation or draft recommendation and sometime in December. So you're supposed to get that January 15th. Yeah.
Right up.
Draft of potential department recommendations related to trapping. Best management practices. And Kim Royer is the point person on that. If you don't know Kim, she's very knowledgeable. Good person to work with.
Retired and came back immediately.
She's at, Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Fish and Wildlife. Okay.
And so those are the major issues that I'm aware of on the subject matter that I work on.
Thank you. Do members have questions for any further questions? Thank you. See you back soon. Was Maria gonna come at 3 or when Michael was done? Do you know?
You want me to stop live streams?
Well, I don't know where our office is, but well, thank you. We'll work.